Greetings and welcome to this latest edition of our Farhang Connect virtual talk series. I am Alireza Ardakani, Executive Director of Farhang Foundation here in Los Angeles. We are a member-supported, non-political, non-religious, not-for-profit organization with the sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the community at large. We are thrilled to welcome you to today's talk, Banning and Belonging, Iranians of the Southern Persian Gulf Coast, a lecture by Dr. Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet. Dr. Kashani-Sabet received her BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she was a Morehead Scholar. She completed her Master's of Arts, Master's of Philosophy, and Ph.D. in History at Yale University. Her book, Frontier Fictions Shaping the Iranian Nation, 1804 to 1946 by Princeton University Press, analyzes the significance of land and border disputes to the process of identity and nation formation, as well as to cultural production in Iran and its borderlands. It pays specific attention to Iran's shared boundaries with the Ottoman Empire, later Iraq, and Turkey, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Persian Gulf region. Her book was translated into Persian by Kitabsara Press in Tehran and has been released in paperback by Princeton Press in 2011. Currently, she is preparing her latest book, due to be published this April, titled Heroes to Hostages, America to Iran, 1800 to 1988. America's historical relationship with Iran and the Islamic world, key moments in the history of U.S.-Iranian relations. She has delivered numerous public presentations drawn from this research project. Professor Kashani-Sabet teaches courses on various aspects of modern Middle Eastern history, including ethnic and political conflicts, borderlands, gender and women's issues, popular culture, diplomatic history, revolutionary ideologies, and general surveys. Dr. Kashani-Sabet directed the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania from 2006 to 2019. She has received funding from various entities, including the Social Science Research Council, to initiate cultural programs related to the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's esteemed guest, Dr. Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for this opportunity to share my research, which I hope will be yet another forming book on the history of Persianate and Iranians of the Persian Gulf coast and of Iraq in the modern period. Thank you.
It is our pleasure, and we're definitely looking forward to hearing your lecture. I will step away and hand things over to you, and I will be back later towards the end of your lecture to review some questions we received from the audience.
Terrific. Thank you again so much for your very kind introduction and for this opportunity.
Thank you.
So I want to begin with an image that I thought is really a very beautiful shot of one of the most strategic waterways in the world, known to us as the Persian Gulf. In the news today and recently, in the past few years, the Persian Gulf has continued to garner a lot of publicity, a lot of the attention of world powers, regional powers, as well as world powers, because of its strategic significance as a trade route, but also because of the confluence of cultural influences and cultural sort of challenges and contestations in these regions, which, by the way, of course, have a historical background and backdrop to it all. This is, going back centuries. The Persian Gulf was and remains a hub of trade, of commerce, and then, as well as now, has maintained its strategic significance. I want to take us to a moment back in 1903. As you know, this was a region in Iran at the time, going into the early 20th century, had already endured decades of imperialism experiences with imperial powers to the north from Russia, to the south from Britain, as Britain expanded its presence from India into the Persian Gulf coast. And most of these encounters actually ended up working against Iran. One of the aspects of my research in my first book was about narrating the history of Iran in a different way, and that was through the story of its territorial losses. So most of Iran's engagement with great powers, particularly Britain, in the 19th century, then revolved around the loss of territory, or about the sort of the contraction of the boundaries of Iran, and the final sort of, not final because boundaries can always change, but for the time being, the recognizable frontiers of Iran as we know them today. That took us centuries, or sort of a decades-long process of trying to delineate these boundaries, including in the Persian Gulf coast. And they were contested. And of course, the boundary with Iraq was very contentious, as we know, and some of these unresolved issues escalated along with other interventions, and they became they took kind of a different course, and sort of erupted after 1980 into the long internecine conflict that became the Iran-Iraq War. But one of the things that I argue is that looking at the moment of British intervention in Iraq, Ottoman Iraq, later modern Iraq, and the Persian Gulf coast really helped to create a different vision of the Middle East that also isolated and marginalized Iran, made Iran territorially very vulnerable. The term that was used, the Shah of Iran also referred to it in this way, was the idea of encirclement, that Iran became very much encircled by sometimes hostile states, but certainly states, even when they weren't hostile, that were very competing with it over national narratives and so on. And today's focus then is going to be on that sort of tug of war, cultural and political tug of war in the Persian Gulf. So I take you to a moment when Lord Curzon, on 18th of November of 1903, the Viceroy of India, George Nathaniel Curzon, left Karachi to embark on an extravagant tour of the Persian Gulf and the southern regions, which were called, because they had concluded treaties with Britain, or truces, it was called the Trucial Coast. Or also it was it had been designated also, quote unquote, as the Pirate Coast. And as I just explained, this region had provided a passage for traders, migrants, pilgrims since antiquity. The Viceroy, Curzon, whose appointment to this vaunted position at the youthful age of 39 had elicited surprise, quickly tried to earn his regal stripes as a noble emissary of the British Empire. Weeks later, when Curzon arrived at Masqat, he held a grand reception, or in English, they wrote it as Durbar. We know it in Persian as Darbar, aboard his ship aptly titled or named Argonaut. From Masqat and later Sharjah, Curzon went to the port of Bandar Abbas, where Sir Arthur Harding, the British minister in Tehran, and Iran's governor of Bushehr, Salar Muazzam, greeted him. A long-time observer of the East, Curzon had traveled across Central Asia and Iran before visiting the latest crown jewels of the British Empire, the Trucial states lining the Persian Gulf littoral. In 1889, he had arrived in Iran and had spent 3 months exploring the country. Though he did not know Persian, Curzon returned to write his 2-volume chef-d'oeuvre, Persia and the Persian Question, an encyclopedic account and geographic panorama of Iran's diverse social and cultural setting. And literally today, this work, despite its biases, and certainly he did have his biases as someone who was in the service of the British Empire and not someone who worked in the interest of the Iranians or the Iranian state, nonetheless, he amassed and documented a lot of information about the social, the climatic, the sort of geographic and cultural issues that he witnessed in Iran in that time period. And by the time Curzon vacated his position of viceroy in 1905, he had been credited with securing Britain's supremacy in the Persian Gulf. So because of the concern over the protection of British India at the time, and increasingly because Iran was viewed as possibly a weak link. Britain was concerned, this was called the Great Game, that, about Russia making its way eventually down through Iran and Afghanistan to India. And so Britain was really consumed in the 19th century with trying to prevent such a scenario from actually taking place. And that is why increasingly the Persian Gulf coast, or the Trucial coast in the south, the southern coast, which Britain always referred to as the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf. And then the northern side was called the Persian side, which I object to strenuously, because no such easy delineation ever existed and could exist except on paper and in the mind of a British imperial official. In any event, Curzon's visit, though largely symbolic in nature, garnered the attention of Iranians from across the coast. Accustomed to watching Britain's expanding presence in these waters, Iran considered the impact of his trip, which manifested Britain's naval ascendancy over Arab communities of the southern coast of the Persian Gulf. Iran's governor of Fars, Alauddoleh, also left Shiraz to make preparations for Curzon's visit. A Persian newspaper that followed Britain's coverage of Curzon's tour observed that a lot of the British journals were attaching particular significance to the viceroy's voyage. As a result, Iran too paid unusual deference to the British presence in these ports, adopting an exceedingly submissive and respectful posture toward Britain. One newspaper wrote, quote, in Persian, "We congratulate all Iranians on the arrival of the august viceroy to the border of our country, as we are hopeful about the outcomes of his trip. We pray to our exalted God for the enduring friendship and unity between Iran and its old friend, the government of England, which today rules over many of our brethren in Eastern lands who share our religion, and we wish for their felicity and happiness." Of course, back in the late Qajar period, official Persian writing was filled with such forms of courtesy and a particular manner of expressing diplomatic ideas. But certainly we can deduce from the differential manner of these words that Iran felt a certain vulnerability, of course, and wondered what else lay on the horizon for it regarding its communities, and also its desiderata and its own strategic interests south of the Persian Gulf. Now, Britain's insistence that it had rightly secured the authority to control these waters gained new significance when the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne, declared in May of 1903, so basically the same year that Curzon had his tour, but earlier in the year. Curzon's tour was in November, that Britain would consider it a hostile act if any power infringed upon its interests in the Persian Gulf. Both Ottoman and Iranian authorities took note of Lansdowne's portentous remarks, recognizing that stability in the Persian Gulf increasingly depended on British policing and surveillance. A year later, Britain also concluded a series of treaties with the Ottoman Empire to safeguard its interests there and to establish the quasi-independence of the sheikdoms under British supervision. or protection. These included, in particular, Kuwait and Bahrain. And the treaties also extended to British access to the Shatt al-Arab or Arand Rud waterway, whose status was being negotiated as part of the boundary delimitation efforts between Iran and the Ottoman Empire, ongoing still in this time period. So the strategic value of the Persian Gulf also acquired new significance when in 1902, so a year before Curzon's tour, the American naval historian Alfred Thayer Mahan labeled it, meaning the Persian Gulf, quote, the pivot, unquote, of defense, and famously coined the term the Middle East in his oft-cited essay, International Relations and the Persian Gulf. In his work, Mahan had laid out Iran's position and Britain's need to safeguard these waters to maintain its naval and economic supremacy. It would, however, be the discovery of oil in Iran at Masjid Suleiman in 1908 that would solidify Britain's hold over these ports in an unprecedented fashion for the next 70 years, or almost 70 years, 60-some years. Since 1901, when the Shah had granted a concession to William Knox Darcy, a British subject, to search for oil, geologists expressed hope that black gold would be struck in these environs. Once explorers found oil in May of 1908, Britain's insistence on controlling southern Iran and the Persian Gulf littoral grew strident. So I want to take a break now from actually reading directly from the paper, and I'm going to shift now to the PowerPoint presentation. And I'll try to do this seamlessly as possible throughout the remainder of my presentation so that we get the historical context, but also get to talk about some larger points in a more sort of informal way. One of the things at this juncture that is really important to point out is that these regions, including what I'm calling the Persian Gulf coast, other historians have called, regions of Eastern Arabia. And so you can see that the way we label things becomes very important, and it really depends on perspective. So it's important to recognize right off the bat that at this particular moment in time, and really going back to, the late 19th century in particular and after, conversations and also historiography of the Persian Gulf remained contested terrain. It is again important to recognize that this is one of the oldest inhabited parts of the Middle East. And I know Iranians don't like to acknowledge this, but this is a historical reality that at different points, different powers were dominant in these regions. This included the Portuguese presence, and Iranians once again regain a dominance during the Safavid period, which also coincided with a significant Dutch presence in these waters. And then the rise of British ascendancy, particular with the establishment of the Persian Gulf, Britain's Persian Gulf residency from 1822 to 1971. And in 1946, the base of the Persian Gulf residency was relocated from Bushehr to Bahrain. And this is very significant because it shows the shift in British thinking about Iran in this time period and how Iran was no longer viewed as a sort of more stable, kind of a reliable site for British imperial interests. And instead it shifted to Bahrain, which also at that time was a lot more dependent on Britain and on Britain's support for the creation of its state infrastructure and its eventual independence. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is by the end of the 19th century, the Ottomans also became very competitive and in these regions, particularly in the southern regions of the Persian Gulf coast, and so they were not only in competition with Iran, but also to some extent with Britain. But Britain really did have naval supremacy by the end of the 19th century in these regions, and that's why there were several British sources that referred to the Persian Gulf in this time period by the early 20th century or late 19th century as a British lake. Because, and the extraordinary thing, and I don't have very good answers for it, is that Iran really didn't have a navy. I mean, you have to ask yourself how that happened, and how Iran expected to assert a kind of dominance when it didn't have a naval presence, but it tried to assert it in other ways that we'll get to, I hope, in this talk. So some of this tension that we see that is cultural between particularly Arab and Arabian dominated narrative and perspectives versus Persian and Iranian ones really also appears in the historiography or the writing of this history. And British accounts, in my view, I have argued, some may disagree with me, but this is still my position, that British accounts, because Iran was one of only two nominally independent states in the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th centuries, British accounts tended not to privilege Iranian perspectives and narratives, and instead gave much more prominence to Arab and Arabian ones. So one of the things that I've written about is, and one of the most important works, of course, is the one I cite here, is John Gordon Lorimer's The Gazetteer of the Persian Gulf, Oman, and Central Arabia. And this work, again, is used by most historians, or many historians who work on this time period in this area. Again, because it has a wealth of information. But I have argued that the information is also gathered in a very particular way. I always found it very surprising that when Iranians were mentioned south of the Persian Gulf coast, and I have in one article, and hopefully in a forthcoming article, I have documented how the number of Iranians mentioned, or Persians is what Lorimer would refer to them, were so minuscule as to be insignificant, and yet other ethnicities were much more dominant. Now, some of this could just be, it could be historically accurate, but some of it, I think, has to be questioned, because we don't know what the metrics were for determining nationality, for determining these numbers and these statistics, and also, in an era where people were not self-identifying as belonging to one ethnicity or another. Many were polyglot; they spoke different languages or multiple languages, and so it was, sometimes difficult to determine that. But even assuming that, there is some accuracy to this, and I do believe there's some accuracy for sure, I think that it would be, we would not be doing our jobs as historians if we didn't also recognize that the individuals, the officials, the British officials writing these works and creating these documents, in fact, did have another end in mind, which was to promote the British agenda. And that agenda included restricting Iran's presence south of the Persian Gulf coast, including Iranian claims, including Iranian people who were located outside of the plateau. And that has continued to be the case. So it has only kind of in many ways escalated in the post-British period. Another very important work, as an example, I cite these as two, very well-known examples of British accounts. The other one is Sir Arnold Wilson's The Persian Gulf, which was published, the Persian Gulf, an historical sketch from the earliest times to the beginning of the 20th century, published in 1928. And this too, again, has, in my view, a very distinctive bias where there is such an insistence that the Arab and Arabian identity of these regions, which was much more prominent. And I think that's a really questionable claim, because migration was occurring in multiple directions. We had communities who were not fully resident, meaning that they were not full-time residents because they were migratory, moving back and forth. And so there were multiple claims to this, including, of course, very legitimate Arab and Arabian claims, but there were also legitimate South Asian claims. There were also legitimate Iranian claims as well. Now, the other accounts you will also see is one of, I think, a really, really solid book is by Rosemary Said Zahlan on the origins of the United Arab Emirates, a political and social history of the Trucial states. And then there are other works that I think are perhaps a little bit more biased, more overtly biased in favor of the Arab and Arabian perspectives, such as the one I mentioned here, Bahrain Through the Ages. And Dr. Zahlan's book actually, I think, is very solid and balanced. But I think that at this point, there was a trend where, among some Arab scholars, and not all, using the term Persian Gulf was no longer common. And so the term was either Gulf, and then some also, started to use the term the Arabian Gulf. And so that became reflected in the historiography of this period as well. And then there are accounts that I call syncretic accounts. The best probably represent works by Dr. Lawrence Potter at Columbia University. He's written many wonderful works, in particular, The Persian Gulf in History, in which he argues about the formation of a distinct Khaliji identity, which I think is compelling, but I think my own sense of this history is that fewer communities are adhering to a Khaliji identity, and still people adhere to their more recognizable ethnic communities, whether it's Persian or Arab or South Asian, or African in a very broad sense, or sort of, from Zanzibar, very, I mean, it's very broad. So there are different ethnicities that people might identify with more readily. And then, of course, there are Persian accounts, some of which I think are similarly very biased. And I think two of the ones that are written from a very distinct Persian or Iranian state perspective are accounts by Ahmad Kasravi and Adamiyat. Of course, Kasravi's was more, oops, oh gosh, whoops, sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. Was, of course, Kasravi was his work on Khuzestan, but, he did also cover the kind of Arab-Persian tensions in these areas. But Feridun Adamiyat wrote about the Bahrain Islands. And, of course, they were promoting the Persian and Iranian state perspective. So I wanted to kind of highlight that increasingly, because of the strategic value of the Persian Gulf, the historiography has changed. And I recently, in a gathering, when I made a point about why I like to call the Persian Gulf, I was confronted by someone who said, well, no, nowadays it's not Persian Gulf anymore. I said, well, my response always is that anyone can call anything what they want. Like, I can't dictate something. I refuse to dictate anything to anyone. But my own perspective is that, most bodies of water take on sort of the largest landmass that abuts them. So in this case, the largest landmass was Iran, or in antiquity, what in Western sources is called Persia. And then secondly, my other point is that if we're to sort of change the name of the Persian Gulf, then we should do that with other places as well. So the Arabian Sea has to change. The Gulf of Oman has to change. So if the emphasis is only on changing the name of the Persian Gulf, then it becomes problematic, because then you run the risk, and I have argued that there is actually a great risk of engaging in a form of ethnic cleansing and cultural erasure. And that's a problem. That is a problem. And, Iran has now unilaterally, for example, renamed the Arabian Sea, the Islamic Sea, or the Indian Ocean, the South Asian Ocean, or the Gulf of Oman, the Gulf of Iran. So when, there's a tendency always to focus on Iran as the one that has to be sort of erased, then it becomes, in my view, problematic. And the historical roots of that, and the reasons, the current geopolitical reasons for that, and the creation of the geopolitical realities that have enabled this, must be examined. So that leads me to the next slide, of course, which is what's in a name. And in fact, there is a lot in a name. The term Arabian Gulf really kind of came into its own when Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt began to refer to the region as the Arabian Gulf. And then with the British decision in 1968 to vacate territories east of the Suez, many of the crucial communities that eventually acquired statehood, the creation of the United Arab Emirates, for example, or countries like Kuwait and Bahrain that also became independent, they also engaged in, or took the decision to start calling this body of water as the Arabian Gulf. Iran, under the Shah, actually objected vehemently. Dr. Adjikani mentioned my forthcoming book. One of the sections of my forthcoming book talks about how, Iran was very frustrated with what it called this sort of made up name. Anytime the term Arabian Gulf was used, they would say this, Name Maj'ul, this sort of made up name that is being used in this, by the new states. And so Iran objected very strenuously, but it really, as I argue, by the 1960s and 70s, Iran had already lost the culture wars, because there was a process of Arabization from the end of the First World War until 1968 that led to the Arabization of the Middle East. Many of the states in the Middle East were viewed as having a dominant Sunni Arab identity because the heads of state tended to be Sunni Arabs, many of them supported by Britain, and also, and that is how the state also was able to enforce Arabization, the teaching of the Arabic language very dominantly through literacy programs. And in that way, by the mid-20th century or the late 20th century, many of these regions that had been like Iran, not very literate, they did become literate, but most, had to become Arabic speaking. And so Arabic and the Arab identity acquired much more dominance in the late 20th century than I would argue it had in the 19th century, because of the creation of state infrastructure. So going back to the whole issue of naming, all of this is reflected in naming, how state policies changed, how the map of the Middle East changed, and so it became reflected. Now, some countries have again opted, or people who don't want to get in the controversy, they say, well, we'll just call it Gulf. Well, that's problematic too, because there are many other Gulfs. There's the Gulf of Mexico. So what Gulf? So there needs to be a specificity. But again, I argue that when you call this particular body of water Gulf, you are engaging in a very deliberate kind of ethnic cleansing. precisely because the only body of water around here that gets renamed is the Persian Gulf. So again, I don't ever dictate. Anyone can call anything whatever they want. There's a freedom. But my own perspective and my own analysis of it is as I've laid out here. The Ottomans referred inconsistently, I will say, but by, in certain or several 19th century documents, they would refer to this region as the Gulf of Basra. But of course, the Ottomans also had, were competitive with Iran. They were competitive over territory. So this was not, an innocuous reference to this region as the Gulf of Basra, because the Ottomans were, nominally at least, in control of Basra. So they also produced maps, but they also had documents and maps that refer to this body of water as also the Persian Gulf. So it was inconsistent. But there is, just so you're aware, that it wasn't just Arabian Gulf and Gulf, but also the Gulf of Basra. And of course, the Persian Gulf, which in most sources, at least in that time period, tended to be the dominant nomenclature for this region. Now, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that this is really the main, I would say, the gist of my argument, which is that it is very difficult for me as someone who is Iranian and Iranian heritage to talk about this, because I understand that, that this is a contested region. Arabs and people of Arabian communities also have their narratives. They have histories there and are a part of it. One of the things I argue is that this is a difficulty we face in the Middle East. It's one of the tragedies, I would say, of the Middle East, is that the model of nationalism that was imposed on our part of the world was one very much like Europe that cast regions as monolingual and monoethnic. That may have worked in Europe. It didn't work very well in the Middle East because there was so much migration, because there were so many multiple layers of empires that came and went and left their imprint on the region. So unfortunately, after the First World War, Britain in particular, as I said, created these, identities. So Iran, Persian, Turkey and Anatolia, Turkish, Syria, Arab, Iraq, Arab. And yet when you look at the history, for most Iranians, it was difficult to look at Iraq and say, well, why is it Arab or only Arab? For Kurds, same thing. Same with Syria. For in Anatolia, we have Armenians in Anatolia. We also had Persian communities in Anatolia. We have Kurds in Anatolia. So it became very, very problematic everywhere you look. And of course, Iran. But Iran in Western historiography is always described as a multi-ethnic state. And it is. And the point I have made as a historian and the distinction I make between Iranian nationalism and Persian nationalism is that because of the loss of territory in the 19th century, Iran and Iranian constitutionalism in particular in the early 20th century created a discourse, a nationalist discourse that recognized the ethnic diversity of its domains. They recognized that Iranians included Kurds and Baluch and, Azeris and, people, Gilanis, where I'm from, a whole Arabs, a whole host of different ethnicities that were a part of this territorial community. Persian nationalism does not do that. Persian nationalism is rooted in the Persian language. And so it became very problematic too in some ways in the 20th century, because the Iranian state also adopted, like other states, a dominant Persian identity, when in fact Persian was not the only language spoken in Iran, as we well know. And so these states, all faced this problem, and they handled it terribly. They engaged in suppression of cultural diversity. They engaged in suppression of other languages. Iran did that. Iran, especially in the interwar period, wanted to unify Iran through this top-down program of Persianization. And some people may say it was necessary and it was important, et cetera, et cetera. But the upshot of it is that it had a lot of problems, and it alienated people who were minorities. Now, the same, of course, is true of Iraq, and Iraq also had a terrible time trying to accommodate its minorities. But the issue here is also compounded by the fact that Persians or Iranians were never recognized as minorities in the Iraqi state with rights, whereas in the Ottoman period, they did have rights of reciprocity. The same is also true, in other parts, say in the Levant. There were Iranians in the Levant too. Again, no mention of them. And of course, there were many, many Iranians in Bahrain and Kuwait and the Trucial states. And instead, Britain, particularly in Bahrain, adopted nationality laws and property laws that made it very difficult for Iranians to hold on to their identity. And I would say citizenship laws in Iraq were also contested by people of Iranian background and heritage in the interwar period. But again, these all go back to British policies. So territories that were under British surveillance or supervision or protection or control, whether they were mandates or, protectorates or whatever other name you wanted to give to them, did tend to have an anti-Persian, in my view, an anti-Persian element. So the question to ask is why? And it's very simple: oil. Iran was the first country in the Middle East to have oil. It was both a boon and a curse. And the curse was that because Britain wanted to restrict the power of Iran and wanted to maintain its dominance of the Iranian oil industry, it did whatever it could to circumscribe Iran in the modern Middle East. That, again, is my argument. Some people may not agree with it, but that is what I maintain through my research and my work. And one of the things that I also want to emphasize is that all of these created tensions that worsened this process of trying to insist on countries in the Middle East after World War I having a monolingual and monoethnic profile. It could never be a reality, and only ended up in disaster because every country in that region has ethnic and religious minorities and other minorities. And so to have embarked on such a careless and such a frivolous even enterprise, I think has created many, many problems and has resulted in clashes that we live with even today. How different would it have been if there had been ideologies and nationalist or national projects or nation-building projects that celebrated instead the plurality of our communities instead of viewing it as a source of negativity. Here, I just want to sort of show you right here. Let me see if I can, there we go. As a map of, I want to show you an Ottoman map that refers to the Persian Gulf as the Gulf of Basra. You see it right here. I just thought you'd be interested in that. The other thing I want to sort of emphasize in this juncture is this whole binary of Arab and Persian. I think that, again, particularly Orientalists, people who have studied the regions that at the time were called the Orient, so those scholars were called Orientalists, they tended to overemphasize and see a stark separation among the races again, they were applying European notions of race to the Middle East. And at the time when we were talking about race, ethnicities were viewed as races. So when you look at anthropological accounts of, from Britain, like the Ethnological Society in the 19th century, ethnicities such as Arab, Persian, Turk, etc., were viewed as races and not as ethnicities. So there was this idea that, these races were distinct and they weren't the same, but they were based on very, sometimes really cockamamie ideas like hair follicles or, things that you just couldn't really prove. And yet they were being published, and sometimes they were being used as a kind of metric that helped to explain, why an Arab and a Persian were different. The point I'm trying to make is that in this history, actually, we see that there was much more contiguity and closeness and interaction and intermingling in a way that then is recognized. That's not to say that some people didn't have a dominant identity, but I think that the interactions weren't always as stark as what was being made. And yet we know from classic accounts such as Ferdowsi or Ibn Khaldun that there was a sense of cultural particularism. So this idea that, as Ferdowsi said, بسی رنج بردم در این سالسی عجم زنده کردم بدین پارسی. Okay, so Parsi is for the Ajam, and Ibn Khaldun, as he talks about, the Asabiya, the Arab Asabiya. So yes, there were, some writers and some ways of classifying communities through these sort of expressions of cultural particularism, even you would say perhaps racial particularism. But at the same time, we also know that the region allowed for this intermingling in ways that were not so stark all the time. Now, European notions of race also kind of assimilated some of these ideas, and the understanding of Arab and Ajam. Ajam, of course, was also a derogatory term. It was not a pleasing term for Iranians. It was meant as a derogatory reference to not only Iranians, but usually it was for Iranians. Most frequently, it was used in a derogatory way to refer to Iranians. But again, I want to say my point really here is to sort of emphasize that we need to be careful how we use these terminologies, that there are real pitfalls in having or in adopting these ways of sort of communities or of people in sort of these racially sort of specific ways. The other thing that we see in this time period and in the history of particularly of Bahrain, and here I want to kind of go back to reading a little bit, is, and I refer to this too, is that one of the ways in which monolingual and monoethnic state identities developed was through new laws of nationality laws, citizenship laws, and also property laws. What belonged to whom and why and how? And how are nationalities determined? All of that is very complicated, and all of these metrics were used by British imperial administrators to create the realities that they wanted on the ground. I very quickly want to kind of take us back to 1924. This is after the war. Iran has sort of realized that although Iran was neutral, in the First World War, its territory was run over by everybody. I mean, it's amazing that we look at Iran after the First World War and we see a nation that is territorially whole, because really this was a very fragmented country. There was no real central power to talk about in the First World War. We had no, serious standing army. I mean, there were some military groups, but they were groups, and so things were very, very precarious, if you think about it. And along with that, so when Iran and its representatives went to try to make a case for war reparations for Iran by trying to have sort of like a rectification, rectification of its frontiers, it was rebuffed by Britain and by Curzon and by others. And so, by 1924, I mean, Iran basically realized that, it was in a very, very vulnerable state. And this was also true for regions like Bahrain that Iran thought it that it had support over. Now, I want to also talk a little bit about this, because I think the complicating issue here is that, there were certainly moments when Iran was more dominant in Bahrain, militarily and otherwise, and tribes in Bahrain sort of expressed their fealty to an Iranian sovereign or governor, as the case might have been. But it was difficult kind of to have a full Iranian claim, because there have been, British documents disputed some of these claims, and also because Iran militarily wasn't in control. So, and also because there are counter, historical claims that have also become much more prominent because of the support that, in my view, Britain lent to certain groups that then became sort of tribal communities that then assumed their leadership and control of these modern states. But in 1924, Iran's Office of Southern Ports expressed concern about the use of British passports by someone who was called a British protected person coming from Bahrain. The traveler, his name was Hamadi, son of Haji Aboud, a resident of Muhammara, also known today as Khorramshahr, and of Bahraini origin, had gone to Bombay or Mumbai. He needed a visa to return to Iran. When he approached Iranian authorities, Hamadi was told that he could not be granted a visa since he was considered an Iranian subject. Iran contended that British protection by dispatching, Iran contended that that Britain was pressuring Bahrainis with ties to Iran or Iranians with ties to Bahrain to accept British protection by dispatching them to India, where they were then given British passports. So you can see how even in as early as 1924, passports were being used by Britain as a way, or travel documents were being used as a way of controlling the flow of migrants, but also of affixing a kind of identity that Iran really felt it had no control over. Now, suspecting that Britain wanted to reduce the number of Persian citizens in Bahrain, Iran decided to deny Hamadi a visa, to which the British administrator inspector in Basra objected. Now, again, I want you to think about the geography too, how all of these regions are so interconnected. From southern Iran, from Mumbai, and then southern Iran into Basra, and then Bahrain. So that there's this kind of like this fluid area where people are going through still in the 1920s in ways that today would not be really imaginable in quite the same way. So that suspecting that Britain wanted to reduce the number of Persian citizens in Bahrain, Iran decided to deny Hamidi a visa, to which the British Administrator Inspector in Basra objected. For its part, Iran complained to Britain that several of its subjects in Muhammara were being obligated, quote, to proceed to Bombay and obtain English passports through some misunderstandings, unquote. Iran contended that Britain was pressuring these individuals, apparently merchants, to travel to India through Karachi to obtain passports under the threat of confiscating their properties in Bahrain. In this manner, the cultural tug of war between Arabs and Persians, or Iranians and Bahrainis, played out in a new guise over these territories and over maritime communities after First World War. Now, although the fate and nationality of Hamidi remains murky, we still don't, I don't know really what happened with his case. This exchange points to the complexities surrounding citizenship and identity in Eastern Arabia and the Persian Gulf. And you could, by extension, also say in Iraq at that time, post 1920. Even the attachment of ethnic labels to identify territories proved political. What did it mean to belong, quote unquote, to Iran or Bahrain? What did citizenship grant individuals who were residents of certain territories at that time? And what did residency mean exactly? How do you prove your residency? Finally, what role did imperial politics play in the designation of citizenship and therefore a formal political affiliation for people who may have embraced fluid ethnic and regional identities at the end of World War I? The experiences of Iranians in Bahrain, or Bahrainis of Iranian heritage, form a part of this multi-layered historical landscape, but one that is often sidestepped in some of the existing scholarship. The unwillingness to tackle this subject partly stems from the infiltration of nationalist and ethnic politics in analyses of the Persian Gulf, a pattern that extends back decades and is reflected in the region's diplomatic history. By the 1960s, Iranians, often perceived to be principally Persians, which is of course not true, were increasingly written out of local histories in Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and elsewhere. Where Persians were mentioned, as I pointed earlier, their communities were frequently described as being marginal or numerically minuscule. For example, as one historian wrote, quote, a sprinkling of Persians in a Baharnaz, and this is in 1954, and thus largely insignificant. So, with the advent of nationalism and the emergence of these new legal definitions intended to establish the sanctity of international borders, the communities of Eastern Arabia and the Persian Gulf have been forced to confront anew the thorny issues of citizenship and belonging. Embedded in these debates is a questioning of how and why some migratory groups and tribes acquire states while others do not. I mean, I think that's a really, really important point. Why did certain tribes, and I've met people actually, or one person in particular, who was telling me about how their family was disenfranchised. So why was one group given control of a state and all this oil wealth and territory, but not another group? And someone else sort of explains it to me as well. They're always winners and losers. And yes, this is certainly true, but this is why we need to write the history, because we can't assume that these creations happened without contestation and without certain people being written out and dispossessed in the creation of these new configuration of states. And I said, communities behave differently as members of majority or minority groups, but critiques of nationalism in the Middle East have tended not to consider both sides of the debate in different settings. The experiences of Iranians as minorities has not been told in transnational histories of the Middle East or the Persian Gulf, and can perhaps help to address some of these matters. So I just wanted to kind of make a point of that, and now we'll continue with the PowerPoint. Now here we see some sample documents that I just referred to that were used. The one on the right is a document called an el-Mukhabar that we see. And then you also see the certificate of identity. So one thing that is really interesting to me is how these individuals, how these documents were being created and used and what's been preserved, and how they are being used actually to assert a kind of identity. It's not so different from a passport, of course, but I just thought I'd sort of show you some of this. And in sort of in a very broad sense, I'm going to try to sum up some of my major arguments in this paper as well, which is that, first of all, there were twin processes here of both identity formation and identity erasure. One of the major points that I want to make today is that imperialism and British colonialism really left a significant and often sometimes very detrimental imprint on the contemporary ethnic map of the Persian Gulf and of the Middle East. And I think one of the things that it did was that it reinforced a very strong anti-Iranian bias that was evident in British knowledge production. This is very significant to me because part of what I'm writing against is how, as I pointed out, like going back to Lorimer's Gazetteer, which I talked about in an earlier slide, one of the things I want to emphasize is that understanding the way in which information is collected and gathered and then put together is very significant. So I do challenge this anti-Iranian bias, which, I'm not the only one to talk about it. Others have written, but I, maybe look at it through different historical lenses and using different sources in British knowledge production. So how was an official, British official who was in the service of empire jotting down things? And I've tried to sort of document that and what I mean when I talk about an anti-Iranian bias. One of the ways in which this happens, of course, is particularly in Iraq, Iranians are always viewed as a fifth column, sort of like they have no legitimacy there. Same thing in Bahrain. It's like, Iranian, no right. I would say to some extent in Kuwait as well. Iranians, fifth column, not, okay, they're here, but really it's not theirs. They have no legitimacy. You compare that to the way in which the narrative on minorities takes place in Iran itself. Iran has done a bad job, as we see even more recently in the uprisings and the revolutionary movement of women, life, freedom, how our minority communities have been targeted yet again. So Iran has not done a good job. But we don't see, a world community basically saying that the minorities in Iran don't have a right. But Iranians as minority communities are not even mentioned. One time, actually, now it could be different now, but I did a Google search on whether even Persian was spoken in some of the countries that were created 50 years ago. Actually, it's been 50 years now, in the southern Persian Gulf coast, if Persian even is mentioned. I didn't see anything. Now, someone could have changed it in the past few years, but that was very surprising to me. And so for me, the process of identity erasure and this erasure of Iranians is a very sensitive one, because I also argue that it was Iran's marginalization and encirclement that necessitated the militarization of the Iranian state, including of the Islamic Republic. The Shah of Iran, I would say, was, friendly to Western powers, as we know, but that didn't gain him anything in the Persian Gulf. And this is a lesson that has not been lost on the Islamic Republic. And yet both the Shah and the Islamic Republic, recognized that safeguarding and having a strong Iranian presence in the Persian Gulf was a necessity for, or that was the argument. The state argument was that, Iran had to guard the Persian Gulf to secure to guard its security. And in this regard, I would say both the Shah and the Islamic Republic have actually proceeded on somewhat similar fashion in trying to sort of assert Iran's military strengths, or to maintain Iran's military strength. The difference now is, though, that, and this is something else that I argue in my forthcoming book, is that much was said about Iran arming in the 1970s, and it was. Iran was, the Shah had a lot of money from oil, particularly after the Arab oil embargo. And, he spent a lot of it buying arms, including billions at the time, which at the time was a lot of money, buying arms. And so there was a sense that Iran is sort of militarizing, but it was militarizing because Iran had this fear of encirclement, rightly or wrongly. And yet, I think it should be said that Iran cannot secure itself simply by arming. Its diplomacy, its relations with its neighbors, its relations with the world at large also must play a role in shaping it. The Islamic Republic of Iran, and I was looking at a survey, was ranked as one of the most unpopular governments in that survey. It was ranked, and so I think that any Iranian state and government must recognize that it can't secure the country simply through arms. That is just not possible. Iranians can't be hated by everybody, especially by their neighbors. So some of that has to be managed through diplomacy, but arms, have become an Iranian reality as well, particularly after the devastating Iran-Iraq War, a war that, the West was largely silent about, even when Iranians, like Kurds and others, became victims of chemical warfare. And that is a lesson that bothers all of us, I think. I think anyone who is Iranian and of Iranian descent, this is something that remains very painful. It's a part of our history, I was a teenager, and this is something that I think was formative for me, even though I left, but still it was something that I remember as the war broke out in Iran. And I think for many of us, whether we were young or old or alive or not alive, this is something that became a very, very important chapter in our history, because, Iran became, the Iran-Iraq War was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. And it was a war that happened in part because of the hate that the Ba'ath regime expressed for Iranians, particularly Saddam Hussein. And I'm not saying Iranians haven't done wrong by Arabs to Iran, and my own work has documented that. And I want to emphasize this today, is that the Iranian state, Persian nationalists, have also engaged in hate. And this also has to stop. Rhetoric of hate matters because it can lead to a huge war. It can contribute to wars because it's an attitude that gets ingrained, and attitudes matter. It helps people make decisions, and sometimes very bad ones. And so we have to do better as a community and as a state as well. We have to be more accepting, allowing multilingualism, while at the same time protecting, or not protecting, but also allowing Iranian culture and Persian culture to exist and to thrive. But that doesn't mean we have to repress everybody else, and so I think that we haven't done a good job, and we should do a better job as well. The other thing I wanted to emphasize in this very complicated, very politicized, very tense history And it is difficult to talk about it because I know that there are so many minefields, and I'm well aware of them. But at the same time, I don't think it's a history that we should avoid or we can afford to avoid, because the Iranian and Persian perspective needs also to be included here and not simply erased or not simply being eradicated as like or invalidated because of the politics of one regime or another. The other thing I want to emphasize is how Iran has also become marginalized in the West and in the historiography of the Persian Gulf, in ways that I've just described. Many of the books that get published do not use Persian sources. There are many, as you saw in the Iranian Foreign Ministry archives, the National Archives, in Iranian newspapers, historical newspapers, etc. There are many, many documents that preserve Iranian attitudes and perspectives on these changes. They have not been documented by scholars who write this history. You cannot tell a history only by looking at one side and not the other. You cannot tell a history by only reading British sources or predominantly British sources. And especially, as I argue, because the British knowledge production itself was tainted. It had a different end in mind. And so understanding that, there's a whole body of research here, or a body of documentation, historical attestations that, show the Iranian and Persian perspective, have to be incorporated. And at the moment, they really are inadequately a part of the existing scholarship. By the same token, Arab and Arabian accounts have to be included, South Asian accounts. And I think that part of the historiography is actually improving largely through the work of anthropologists who have gone and documented the experiences of, of migrant workers in particular in southern Gulf communities. And recently we saw in Qatar as well with the World Cup, that these issues were also still very much dominant about the experiences of migrant workers. But again, there's been less conversation about Iranians as minority communities, or as not even minority, as people who have had a long-standing presence, not just in the Iranian plateau, but also in Bahrain or in Kuwait or in Qatar or in Oman or in, Dubai, right? And then finally, I want to emphasize that racism and violence become consequences of identity erasure and denial. We saw this in Iran just recently. We've seen it. We also see it toward Iranians in other places. And so I think it's not just, it's multi-directional, and it has happened in different ways, in different contexts, but with the same very unfortunate, inhumane, intolerant impulses and consequences. And so, the ethnic conflicts of the Persian Gulf, as I argue, become a microcosm for the contemporary battles waged in the Middle East, which we're seeing in different regions. And I think that Iran was always most successful in our history. Iran was most successful when it was able to accommodate cultural pluralism, religious pluralism. This is something I know many of us as Iranians are proud of. Some of our literature, Sadi and others, talk about the Iranian accommodation of difference, and so I think that it is unfortunate to me, again, it's a tragedy of modern nationalism in Iran and in the Persian Gulf and in many other countries of the Middle East, that this beauty of our region and of our country and of this history that is interconnected has not been a source of celebration. And instead, it's become this ridiculous sort of, and even in many ways, very unrealistic attempt to kind of fuel ethnic rivalry and ethnic ethnocentrism. Thank you very much.
This was so informative, and it has a whole layer of additional content that's so relevant today to what's happening in that region and specifically in Iran. So we don't have a lot of time, but I have a few questions that I wanted to share with you. One of the questions that we have a lot of versions of it is, as a historian, what do you think brings different Iranian ethnicities together and gives them a sense of unity to fight for their country, both as witnessed in the Iran-Iraq war and now in the fight against the current regime of the Islamic Republic? And what makes southern regions of Iran more prominent and fearless oppositions to the current, in the current uprising?
So I think that the source of unity that we can count on is humanity. I mean, I think that is really, that is what we as modern Iranians hold on to. When you think about, just go back a couple years ago when the Cyrus cylinder was touring, there was not a single Iranian who wasn't touched by it, right?
Yes.
I mean, and you didn't need to know the whole history, and there was a lot of like mythology that was also brought in with it. But the long and short of it was that we want to be remembered as a civilization, as a community, as a people who are tolerant, not hateful. And I think that is the one unifying message that will allow Iran to reclaim its place among nations. It will allow Iran to reclaim its place among a community of people, Iranians, among a community of people who want tolerance and freedom and peace, and who recognize and who celebrate our diversity instead of knocking one another down because we're different. You wear a hat, I don't. I have glasses, you don't. I mean, and that's a very simplistic way of getting at it. But really, I think the message that we saw in the current uprising, and that we're seeing in the history of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, is that this attempt to kind of erase other people is a failure. Iran has done it too. I want to be really clear. We're guilty. We have done it. And we are still doing it. But we cannot survive as a people, as a civilization, as a community, as a nation, if we don't change. And I would think that that's also true in other places.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you mentioned, rhetoric of hate matters. So the diversity is so important. And it should be celebrated. Another question we have is, do you think a weaker government in Iran has further allowed neighboring countries to use the term Arabian Gulf more readily and erase Iran's presence in many ways? Or?
No, I don't think Iran has control over it. I mean, and that's the point I'm trying to make. I always thought it was interesting when I'm in the course of writing this history, especially with Bahrain, that, Iranian governments, would say, this is our 14th province. Well, I mean, it's great that you say it's your 14th province, but that's not what everyone else was saying. I mean, and so I think it's really hard sometimes for Iranians to look at this history from another perspective. And yet that's what is being demanded. And I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that this is a weaker or stronger government. I mean, yes, Iran was weak, but it was always going to be weak vis-a-vis a superpower. Iran is still weak vis-a-vis militarily, vis-a-vis the United States or Britain or even Russia. We may think not, and maybe it's not as weak as it once was. I don't know. I'm not a military historian, but I think we are deluding ourselves to think that somehow, we had the power to kind of force Britain to do things differently. I mean, I think that Iran progressively became militarized because it realized that it had to be militarily strong to preserve itself. How could Iran not learn this lesson? Think about it. Not only were we run over by the First World War, the Second World War was a disaster. I mean, you know, Iran, Reza Shah finally creates the semblance of a navy. It wasn't even that great. What happens? And then a couple of hours, our army and navy in Second World War decimated, completely kaput. You know, and then you go into, you know, and then the Shah buying all these, you know, weapons and whatever. Yes, and it did help Iran in the Iran-Iraq war for sure. But at the end of the day, I mean, you know, again, Iran needed international intervention. You know, so I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, you know, that government was weak, this government is strong. I think Iran will have its weaknesses precisely because it is now encircled. And so this is the reality, this is the geopolitical reality of Iran, unfortunately. And I say unfortunate because I see it as a source of instability. You know, because Iran will continue to feel vulnerable when faced with states surrounding it that do want to engage in nefarious behavior. And they have. I mean, we can't deny that. But the response is also elicited partly because the Iranian government itself does nefarious things to other people. You know, Iran is not innocent. I mean, it's not like, oh, I'm just a victim. No. You know, and I think that's, in fact, one of the lessons that was learned from this devastating Iran-Iraq war, that Iran is truly on its own, you know, and so that's a harsh lesson. You know, it hardened people, it hardened the state and the country. But hardening shouldn't result in ideologies and state ideologies that are inhumane. I think that is also the wrong lesson. That because of this experience, Iran has to be basically a top-down controlled military theocratic fascist state. No, no. That some of Iran's security actually might be gained through a government, as I said previously, a government and a state that is respected and can restore its humanity in people's eyes and restore humanity generally, which is what this movement, this revolutionary women, life, freedom movement has done for Iran.
That's very well said. And I think that's a great place to end today's conversation. And we're all hopeful for that to come for Iran. Thank you again for this great talk. And we look forward to your new book, which is going to be published in April. And thank you for all the research that you've done on the subject matter. I would like to also thank all the viewers who have joined us from all over the world today to be with us for this talk. And we look forward to welcoming them again at our next talk. We bid you all a very nice rest of your day, and until next time, have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.